information to scrutiny. And as you all know, if information that you receive is how you perceive the world, how you make your own views, how you yourself disseminate information to others. So, like Foucault said, whoever controls information controls the regime of truth. And what we were seeing, a fundamental change was taking place, especially after the global economic crisis, when there was a lot of churn happening all over the world. And slowly, platforms, technological platforms like Orkut of Google became a big networking tool. Facebook came later on, but Orkut was the huge thing, big thing there. For the first time, people thought that they had a direct entry into information, how they actually became, they felt powerful and they said that, wow, this is a new tool which makes us feel empowered and this is leveling the playing field. And this brings us to this topic of why suddenly I woke up to this whole possibility of social media and democracy. Is that all academics come to this topic from a certain position, from certain experience. And mine was not only collecting information and seeing more and more companies trying to prevent people from becoming vociferous on social networks to their detriment, but also from company or from politicians and parties trying to manipulate that information. And that seemed interesting because now at this moment, we are at this juncture of a conflict between those who want to control information and those who want information to be an empowering tool. And what we see is that this has also reflected in the way social media has evolved. So, what is my topic for today and how I'm going to go about it? I was given a broad topic: social media and democracy, polarization in media and politics. Polarization is just one effect of social media, and there's a lot of dispute about it. That is there a filter bubble? Are there echo chambers? So in different contexts, different samples, if you go, there are different viewpoints. So what I want to do is, if you all are interested in researching on this broad topic of technology and politics, and by this, I just don't mean social media platforms. I mean social media platforms, social messaging platforms. I mean Internet of Things, IT-enabled technologies. I mean AI technologies, artificial intelligence technologies. Some of you may be aware of this, but for those who are not aware, so even before I start a discussion on this, I think some sort of a definitional clarity is needed. What do I mean by AI, artificial intelligence things? All technologies you use has something called, they adopt something called machine learning. With our behavior, they get to learn things about our interests, about the way, about about the users, and they feed that to the machines. That is a machine learning, and that feeds artificial intelligence, and that is how we are curated as users. Our information is curated, and we may be targeted for good or for bad. It can go both ways. It might help us in terms of consumer users, it may harm us in terms of consumer harms. So this broad category of technological tools is what we deal with when we talk about technology and politics. So what I will be talking about today is, I'll give you a broad view of certain basic ideas that we use before we even approach our research topics. Now, this is a research topic that is interdisciplinary. You have an anthropologist, Manisha was kindly enough to introduce me today. This is a field that is run by political scientists, computational scientists. Everybody is working with each other. So this is not something that can be just about political scientists or just about anthropologists or sociologists or economists. It is something for the first time we see life sciences and human sciences coming together to deal with the topic on how technology affects our life. So my first 10-15 minutes, I'll talk about these broad ideas. And next 10-15 minutes, I'll talk about certain personal things that I found during my research topics on three main areas, which is on social media and politics, on disinformation, and on surveillance and privacy tools, which are interconnected concerns. When we start discussing, when we start dealing with the use of social media, often we try to focus only on how it is affecting political campaigning, how political campaigns and communications have changed. But there are some big questions that come up here, which more and more onboarding of politics into technological platforms raises. What are those big questions? Those big questions are, who represents us? How do we represent ourselves? Who informs us? How do we inform ourselves and inform others? Who gets what? As more and more digital services are coming up, even like digital democracy is also a service thing, So who gets what is a very vital question that needs to be answered. What we see that over the period of last decade or so, we see that social technology as such is not just challenging conventional notions of democratic processes, of democratic power relations, but not just challenging, but capsizing these conventional notions and turning them on their head. And these are fundamental changes on our personhood, who we are as persons. We get to know by our behavior and use of social media and messaging services and technology. How much are we empowered or viewed by the state? We get to know by our use of social media and our services. And so there are changes coming up, not just in political communications and campaigning, but also in personal and social practices. And in this area of social practices comes the whole high order effects of polarization, societal rifts, all of us becoming in our filter bubbles or completely leaving what was considered to be appropriate behavior, appropriate talk. A norms construction is happening through this usage. So this begets two main questions about what are the key, how do we approach this topic? So there are two starting points. First is that previously there used to be a habit of saying that there is a personal space, there is there is the meat space. There is the meat, which is supposedly the real world, and there is the virtual space, which is the digital world. And people used to say that something there is that digital is not the real, and that there might be effects between both. But slowly and slowly, over the past few years, we have seen an erosion of this kind of a border between the meat spaces and the virtual spaces. So digital is real. And therefore, whatever happens in digital politics and digital democracy is also real politics and real democracy. I myself did a paper on online hate speech resulting in offline violence. And as I went deeper and deeper into the study, I see that this kind of a division is artificial because digital is embedded in a social and real context. And as more and more we start using it, digital becomes real. So the first key point while doing research on digital politics is that digital is real. Second is that when we talk about technology and politics, we talk about democracy, for example, if not authoritarian rule. Then when we talk about democracy, what we see is that Whatever may be the idea of democracy, most of you are political science students, so you have heard that there are many different conceptions of what democracy means. It can mean something totally different in Germany and something totally different in America. In India itself, we are trying to figure out whether we are a democracy and what kind of democracy we are. So it is a changing concept. However, however much it changes, there are certain essential lineaments of democracy, and these were born in the old conditions. How? So you have an old model of democracy and what are its fundamental notions on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have technology, the current platform politics technology, which is completely new, which was born in completely new situation. And therefore, you have a new model. And this is what media scholar Benjamin Breton calls accidental megastructures. What does that mean? Technology like social media platforms, for example, they started as social network platforms. From a boys' dorm in a college, it decides world politics. So slowly and slowly, you see technology in warp speed suddenly took on itself amount of responsibilities that it is not equipped to deal with. And this evolution happened very fast. And therefore, you have this mismatch between old world democracy and new world technology. And therefore, both need to, when we talk about technology and politics, which need each other, they also need to deal with the new changes and demands and user patterns. So the second uh, key starting point after digital and is real is that technology and politics both need to change to adapt to new users and demands. From this comes the background, like how has this technology evolved? We can see three phases of evolution of technology and politics. Now, the first stage was of technological tools being considered to be inherently democratic. We had the hope of all social movements happening in West Asia, and the Arab Spring, for example, was seen as an example of the new platforms, technological platforms, providing this arsenal, the digital arsenal, to the traditionally disempowered citizens, giving them voice and giving them access to information, allowing them to mobilize and fight. And therefore, there was this huge hope that after centuries of top down control and politics, what we have is an opportunity of bottom up way of doing politics, of doing power relations, of doing information. And that was a very attractive promise that the first stage of social media platforms presented. But soon, what one finds that this was seen to be a false promise, a fallacious reason, because slowly and slowly, what we saw that digital sovereignty, the whole promise of digital sovereignty, suddenly mutates into digital surveillance. That, yes, there are technological tools, but they also drive on profit models. And it is not inherently democratic, but it is inherently built to privilege certain views and power relations, most likely those entrenched power relations in which it is based. And therefore, from the tools of self expression, social media platforms slowly and slowly mutated into tools of collective control. And this created a tussle because already it was being used for personal expression. It was already being a democratic platform, but then you have this you see the state trying to intrude into it, big tech companies, small companies becoming suddenly big tech companies, and the old brick and mortar monopolies of industries suddenly becoming a more dangerous kind of monopoly of big tech companies, because this time they were right in your bedrooms. This time, the power of a company was not just what they did outside, but it was also inside, right into your bedroom they came into. So, this was the second phase of this clash that is happening slowly in growth. And the third phase is what we are at present, which is the pandemic related phase. So while there was the whole promise of digital democracy, digital society, digital services, and there was also the fear of big of state control, of big tech control, of risks happening. Pandemic brought in a new phase, which was the bandwidth of consumption suddenly increased. Now more and people, just like all of you, just now you said that now it's a good thing that we can, geography doesn't matter, we can connect more. But as we are connecting more, your consumption of data is increasing, the storage of data is increasing, the way you are being tracked is increasing, and you cannot do anything about it. So pandemic on the one hand is very good, because now I think most of you who are who are not poor, because the poor have been shafted, but those who are not poor, for them life has become easier. So pandemic has exacerbated existing socioeconomic divides, especially the digital divides, and brought in a new threat. And what is a new threat is that those who were still getting access to education are now not getting access to that kind of education because they don't have that money. Digital divide, when it increases development divide. And therefore, this is the situation for something good to happen. This is the situation when we go back to the key starter. The second point is that when there's a tussle between old concept of democracy and new concept of technology, technology needs to adapt itself and become better to service a concept of a more egalitarian, of a more developmental notion of what it means to be a citizen in a mature or in a maturing democracy. Because at this moment, the higher order risks of polarization, of authoritarianism is high as it has never ever before been. Because now we have no other option but to be digital. And therefore, this also provides us with a window of opportunity to what to do it. So all this four evolutionary stage brings us to the current pandemic and higher order risk, brings us to the current fundamental understandings of technology and politics. What are these current fundamental understandings? The first is the materiality of social media and how it impacts the hegemony of information and power relations. Media ecology scholar Marshall McLuhan had said medium is the message. And there are a lot of cliched people, like people bandy this message around. Yeah, medium is the message. But what does that exactly mean? It's not that social media suddenly changes the way you think. No, that is not what he meant by medium is the message. What he meant is that social media is an environment. It is an infrastructure. It is not just a network. So, as an environment, it can allow certain ideas to flourish. It can allow certain behaviors to flourish. And by this, it can allow certain power relations to flourish. And this environment that it creates, if there is any fundamental change in this environment, this is just like what Aristotle had spoken about in terms of essence. If an essence changes, ideas change, substance changes. And therefore, you see when the essence, when the environment changes, the ideas changes. And therefore, to give you an example, few years back, it wouldn't have been right for us to say name call, a particular name call, or use certain kind of a language. But now that has become normal because there has been this because the way social media is designed, it allows for its algorithms allow for content which generate extreme emotions. And because that is the whole idea of immediacy, what we call the contagion effect of social media, what it is called in media studies. The contagion effect is as soon as something negative is said, the algorithm will push it right into the front. So that is the way the environment is designed. And if it is fear, or it is something that appeals to the fear, something that appeals to your biases, that is something which generates insights, invokes extreme emotion, it will push that content forward. And then what happens is that somebody gets engaged with that content and it triggers traction. And when a post develops traction, it's people think, okay, this is something normal because there are others who feel like what I feel. And so it's perfectly normal to say that. And therefore, there are a lot of people who say that, oh, we should reach across the aisle and try to educate people about norms construction. But there have been experiments that show that even if you, for example, for fact checking, even if you show Brendan Nyhan and all they have done experiments to show that even if you expose people or you correct people and tell them that what you're seeing is falsehood, is not fact. If they think that no, this subscribes to my bias, then they will discount the fact checked information. And therefore, it's very difficult to educate people because no one likes to be corrected. In your own family, you try it. So when you try to convince, when you can't convince your family, what are you going to convince a population in millions? So that's where the environment plays a role, the algorithm plays a role when human agency doesn't allow fact checking to happen. Then environment, the way the materiality of the medium is constructed is very important. And therefore, to say that platforms have no responsibility is highly responsible, which Facebook and many other Facebook to a large extent, Google and Facebook have been doing that. YouTube has become, in America, we have been studying QAnon. Fringe extreme right group has now become mainstreamed. They were full of conspiracy theories and they have been mainstream because the materiality of medium allowed that kind of conspiracy generating platform handles to flourish. So if there has to be a change, there has to be a change in the environment. Second, Michael Moore, a scholar from King's College London, who studies media and politics, and social media especially, and politics, he raised three major concerns: that where are we going with our democracy? Which way, given that the current situation, the fourth stage, we have come to, where can we go? We know that the materiality of medium is like this. We know that the earlier promises were belied. So where do we go from here for course correction? So he said that the road forks into three areas. Which way can we go? A democracy can first become a platform democracy. What does that mean? That means that platforms become very important. More than anybody else, the dominating force, the power, the dominion is on the platforms. That is, it doesn't matter which government I vote for, but I cannot afford to leave Facebook, or I cannot afford to leave Twitter. Why? Because platform arrogates to itself more and more powers. Like you see, this is called inscription in computer science. This thing of bringing, increasing the remit of your functions is called inscriptions, because platforms develop their functions through user platform interaction. And as users start using platforms for more and more, which is supposed to be a democratic process, what happens instead is that platforms become more powerful. How? Again, example of Facebook. What was Facebook? Or Instagram, a place for just posting photographs, has become also a site for political campaigning, happy post campaigning, that is called. Instagram has become a platform for youth-centric positive post campaigning, while Facebook is a general audience negative post campaigning, while Twitter is a public broadcast platform. And what have they done? But when they started, that was not what they were meant to be. Their functions were pretty delineated and fixed. But as the users started using it for different platforms, they found it that it's profitable to venture into different areas. And therefore, platform democracy means that people become totally dependent on platforms, to the extent that platforms which were gateways for commercial services suddenly become gateways for public and essential services. That is, I need my news fix from platforms. I need my information from platforms. I need health information, access to health and education from platforms. So this is one road in which we can go if there is no course correction. That is platform democracy, where we become over-dependent on platforms for essential services, to the extent they become more important than state itself. Second road that we can go is to what Moore calls is surveillance democracy. As I spoke about digital surveillance increasing after the pandemic, is that now more and more invasive technologies are being used to target us. In politics, we are targeted. They see our behavior on Facebook, what kind of comments we are writing, who are our networks. Many of you play those games on Facebook, like, what does my sun's sign indicate who I am? Please don't play those games, because let me warn you, a wealth of your data is being collected from those games. So it's really, really dangerous to play those games. So I'm digressing a bit, because there's something really close to my heart. Go to your Facebook privacy settings, prevent third-party apps from accessing your data, as well as gamification apps from accessing your data, because then you get gamed. So be very careful about that. So coming to surveillance democracy is that invasive technology determines who we are. Our entire identity is like we become surveilled citizens. Means the state has so much power that they come into our bedrooms, and not just into our bedrooms, they come into our personhoods. Previously said states should not have their eyes inside your bedroom, but now they have eyes inside your body, because you will wear a Fitbit watch, you will go and do Amazon, you will have Alexa, you have these AI. So when I told you about AI, IoT and AI, we have these so many technologies at our disposal, our cell phones. All of these are every second taking our data. And this is not fear mongering. This is a real threat. And what does that mean? By invasive technologies, states can then decide who is a citizen and who is not. For example, China. And see, China is a nice hate crush of most of us. It's happening in democracies. But this, I hope you see the Chinese example, and you see in different democracies whether that is being replicated, especially facial technology recognition tools in India, policing, the police states. So you have the Great Firewall of China, the Great Fire Shield of China, that controls networks of information flow. Same thing is happening in different democracies around the world, including ours. And social credit system in China basically decides from consumer behavior what you get access to, what you get denied. So you're punished for even stating certain views. And there is a real and present danger of this happening even in our country, even in every other country, because according to, for example, contact tracing apps, we don't know the source code of many of the apps. Even for our app, there was a source code open, but there was lot of the technology experts, they raised red flags, and therefore it's very difficult to regulate this. So surveillance democracy is basically where citizens start accepting surveillance as not being contrary to their liberties. They think that it is a normal part of life to be surveilled and to be. So what it has a chilling effect on you. Means you don't speak up, you don't say anything, you decide that this is the way to behave, this is not the way to behave, and you think it is good for you. Because you think that this is for your own good that you are behaving in this way. And that you basically put your, this becomes the new Leviathan where you think that that's for your own well-being, that you are denied your actual, your personhood becomes defined by an algorithm, because that's what it boils down to. Remember, there have been cases, there have been studies in America about racial segregation happening, racial biases happening. There is an article by Markup on how this year itself, a lot of people were suffered because of machines goofing up, and machines would goof up. And remember, machines, after all, are controlled by humans. So this brings us to the third road which we can go to, which is called digital democracy. The third road, which is, so this is what Moore says is that, so these two are dangerous roads. That how do we deal with this danger? Because these are not something that is happening in the faraway future, but it's actually happening. It can happen now in the near future. So how do we deal with it? So to deal with it, it says, let's re-hack democracy, because democracy has been hacked. Let's re-hack using the digital platforms, democracy, and make platforms more accountable. And to make platforms more accountable, what do we target? So here, there's been a huge amount of literature on these big questions. And one which I really found convincing is a recent book by Ronald Dreibert. Ronald Dreibert has been doing a lot of work. He's the director of Citizen Lab, and he's a political scientist. And this has been something that he's been dealing with privacy and surveillance for a long time. So he comes at it from a huge wealth of experience. So he calls this the 4 painful truths of digital democracy, or the 4 painful truths of technology and politics. Let's make it more generic. The first is surveillance capital. Now, the term surveillance capital means surveillance is paying, and therefore big companies dominate the surveillance industry and think that this is incentivized, and therefore because they have controlled data, they control humans. And this was a term first used by Vincent Mosca, and a book was written by Shoshana Zuboff recently called Surveillance Capitalism, which actually raises the alarm about big tech companies, because you have a monopoly of just 5 major companies. You have Alphabet, that is Google, you have Amazon, you have Apple, at least Apple's privacy policy is better, you have Facebook, and you have Microsoft. And all these major companies are determined, they are what is called they are called Technica, the new superpowers in place of old superpowers. So those who are doing IR, and you should start seeing this can be a nice research area, talking about how big tech is changing the traditional political, industrial, military complex and all. Second painful truth is social psychology of social media. Like, if you remember, right at the beginning, I had spoken about what is AI and machine learning. Why did I tell you that? Is that social media is just not an environment or just not a network or infrastructure, but there is a psychological element involved in it. What does that mean? Is that it uses to algorithms to determine user behavior, user attitudes, user this thing. But these algorithms are done by whom? By humans. So algorithms are not just machines and technology, but they incorporate the biases of their human handlers. And this is something which is called coded bias. There are some brilliant books on it. If you have an opportunity, I would recommend, definitely recommend. Please do read Safia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. Virginia Eubanks, who has written about how algorithms are creating a new global underclass of people, especially after pandemic, you can realize how this is actually happening. Then there is Ruha Benjamin, who has also spoken about race after technology. This is about race, but it also applies to marginalized communities, even in different parts of the world. This can form a very good thing. So algorithms incorporate the bias of their creators, and therefore you can see them actually pushing. For example, you are having these video webinars, these kind of video meetings. But there have been reports when it first started during pandemic that black faces were not being visible. When they had an artificial black background, black faces were not being visible. So there was a color bias which was coded into the algorithms, which was privileging the whites over the blacks. So the second painful truth is the social psychology of algorithms that privileges a particular race or power group over others. The third painful truth is what we had previously spoken about is state surveillance. The prospect of state surveillance, especially in democracies, is growing. And in less than mature democracies where there are no checks and balances involved, it can be life-threatening to marginalized communities and to high-risk users like journalists, human rights activists. You all have heard about the Pegasus NSO WhatsApp hack, where phones of activists, academics, journalists were used to totally, completely compromised to surveil them. And that happened through WhatsApp, where they didn't even have to pick up a call to get surveilled. So you see the dangers. And recently, a new report has come about Pegasus of NSO again being the usual culprit about this. So state surveillance can prove life-threatening for many marginalized communities. And the fourth painful truth is technology is also leading to environmental pollution and degradation. The more we are consuming data, remember, data doesn't operate in vacuum, it needs an infrastructure. And therefore, a lot of environmental degradation is happening, mining is happening, spectrum is being used. And this is unchecked, and this is not getting that kind of attention it needs. And environment, ecology is as important to any discourse on politics as to technology. And therefore, what can be the solution to all this? Coming to the end of this macro discussion is what can be the solution? So targeting these four areas is essential to decide if we can reset democracy, as Dreibert says, or retool democracy, as Andreas Junger says, and bring it back to the right course where it can actually serve democratic ideals rather than push us back forward or create a grotesque version of democracy. And what are some of these solutions? Is that first he calls is Reiberts talks about, as well as Jamie Bartlett in People versus Tech talks about reset or restraint. We need to restrain the big tech companies. There has to be certain rules and regulations in place, because don't expect people to change. That suddenly they will outgrow their biases and say that's not going to happen. But the materiality of the medium has to change so that people's behavior can being modulated. Anyway, we are getting socially re-engineered. So let's socially re-engineer it for the better than for the worse. So one thing is restraint, regulation, transparency. And in transparency is important is that here we come to a paradox. While our data is being accessible to everyone, to the state, to the big tech companies, and we are becoming more and more transparent, their data is not accessible to us. There is a complete black boxing of their data. And by that way, neither can we check states surveillance, nor can we check big tech surveillance. So we are being shafted both ways. And therefore, the second important thing is transparency. Third important thing is accountability. And these seem like, cliched terms, but without these, there can be no progress and nothing can be, we can't go ahead. With these four dangers, if we don't deal with it, then we are going to go either into the platform democracy way or the surveillance democracy way. The choice is now, and the choice has to be done now. If I quickly, I think that it's going to 1 hour.
No, it's okay. You can carry on. No problem.
I was thinking I will just give a few findings about what I have found in my own research.
Sure, sure. Please
And
go.
then we can open the floor. Otherwise, I'm boring you, so I don't want to bore you all. And by
No, no, no. Please go ahead.
okay, so coming to some of my major findings is that let me start with a recent thing that I have found is about news consumption. Since you spoke about polarization and media, news consumption and polarization. So in 2019, my paper was on, I wanted to, I never assume anything. Like I've always been a bit shy of assuming anything. And that's the whole purpose of research is there polarization? Is there a kind of a filter bubble happening? And there's a lot of literature out there where they say that a more a better term to use, which you should speak about, is that there is a lot of cross exposure happening of information, incidental exposure happening of information, what media scholars write about. And by this, we may be living in echo chambers, but not exactly filter bubbles. That is, we are exposed to outside information, so we are not living in a filter bubble, but we prefer echo chambers, that is to network in groups that will confirm what we are saying. So basically we get information which is outside, but we prefer socializing in groups. For us to gain the information, we have cross exposure, but for talking and engaging and exposing, we prefer people with our own mentality. And we tend to be with people who are, there's homophily, what it is called, and not heterophily. We prefer people with our own views. I wanted to test that. And therefore, in the last election, 2019 election, I decided, let me try that with the first-time voters. So this is just a small sample. I don't want to extrapolate it and bring it to a larger view of whether that is true for a larger group. And therefore, what would be my sample group? So I decided, let me go with first-time voters who actually are interested in politics, because any study on social media and messaging services shows that majority of them use it for entertainment and recreational usages and transactional usages like payments or shopping, rather than information per se. That is hardcore information, which is called hard news and soft news. So people mostly go for soft news like entertainment, culture, rather than hard news like politics and economics. So I wanted a sample group that actually took this hard news of politics and economics. So I went and surveyed journalists, students who are studying to be political and economic, and basically journalism students who were not only consumers of information and hard news, but were also going to be major information agents after they pass out. So I wanted to see where did they consume news from? Did that make them polarized? Or how did such a news affect them? And I wanted not just any news, I wanted to focus on disinformation. Disinformation is top down, false news, information deliberately spread, intending to either for profit or for politics or for propaganda. These are called influence campaigns, which are deliberately done, as opposed to misinformation, which is not deliberately spread. It's not like your uncle would say or your auntie would say that this is for that this is a cure, this magic cure for coronavirus. Not that kind of a thing. So we exposed them to the major political parties. There was a treatment group where we exposed random control trials. We exposed one group to disinformation and one group not to disinformation. Just a normal fact-checked news about politics, economics, and we wanted to see that over a period of time, did they get polarized? Means over a point of time, did they change their views? So before even starting that experiment, I had to see where did they stand in the political spectrum, the spectrum of whether they were BJP supporters or Congress supporters or CPIM supporters. I took the ideological parties that had certain ideologies, which came in the spectrum of right, left, center, right. As you all know, unlike US, we can't clearly do right wing, left wing, centrist. We have a whole spectrum of ideologies and where they stood. And accordingly, the respondents were measured before we exposed them to two different set of views, which was contrary or affirming of their ideologies. And what I found over the piece of this experiment was that surprisingly, journalism students were consuming news. Majority of them were consuming news from digital platforms and not through textual means. Majority of them were consuming it through memes. And imagine that they will grow up to be fact checkers, means they will grow up to be journalism students where fact checking is an inherent topic for them to study, how to fact check, how to be an editorial gatekeeper, how to check news. And we all know that they are taught not to go with the headlines. Headlines must reflect the lead and the content of the story. And they had to create nut graphs, that is executive summaries of it. Yet they were consuming news through memes, which was a bit worrying. Anyway, but what was not worrying and which was extremely heartening to see is that majority of them actually they grew up in this age of social media because they were 19 to 21-year-olds. So majority of them actually grew up. So for them, social media, like you all, I guess. Yes, you all are the generation that I was targeting. So majority of them actually did not change their views, actually did not get misdirected or influenced. So this is something very interesting because first-time voters will become seasoned voters when they grow up. And it can show us which direction the youth will go. So this was very interesting to see that social media actually did not, disinformation actually, despite them getting it through memes, their own pre-existing political ideology and pre-existing biases is the main factor that we must study. Social media can amplify it or may not change it, but it does not completely create a mind shift. But what it can do is not amplify the wrong news. And from this, again, it brings back to my materiality of social media, is that again, we need to bring back platform responsibility because people will always carry forward their existing biases, but the environment can be such which can show that what is the correct norm, which is not. And that is something which is interesting to see. So this was a this is a research that I want to make it in a bigger way and go just not to journalism students, but students across. But it was a very good indication to see about the effects of news exposure, news consumption, from where are they getting this news, and how does this news consumption affect their behavior, how it affects their attitude. So this is called affective polarization, whether they get angry or whether they get fearful. Does it do it? So obviously, like if you get very provocative postures, you get very angry. But I think I need to do a I need to do another. This I had done in 2019 at the heart of the election coverage, elections, the entire 6 months before and during and after elections. But I think I need to do it now because I saw a lot of conspiracy and news happening, and a lot of like the youth tending to react very quickly. So I need to go and do this because my hope is always on the youth. So let's just see how it goes. So I think I will end it with this and get flow to you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. That was a wonderful, wonderful exposition, and I think it was so. You brought it out so explicitly. The various right beginning from, how different types of democracies and different. In fact, you began actually by delineating different types of social media rather than jump. We normally tend to jumble it all up together and talk of one social media or one digital media, but the way you delineated the whole thing and the way you brought out about the kinds of democracy that the digital media can perpetuate, and both the pluses and the minuses going forward. And it's been wonderful, and I can see a lot of questions popping up so I would request Taha. Would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes, of course, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah. Introduce yourself and you can ask the question.
Yes. Firstly, I would like to thank Sangeeta ma'am for joining us for the discussion. It was an extremely relevant and very crucial topic that we would usually overlook, and we got huge perspective on it. So thank you so much to Sangeeta ma'am. And as a student of SNDT, would like to thank her for joining us for the entire discussion. My question would be, ma'am, as a layman, you can say that, like you rightly mentioned, we live in a very information drenched social media environment, and where on one hand we would be subjected to extensive information, and but on the other hand we're also subjected to these, like you mentioned, echo chambers of propaganda and hate speech, or things that form our opinions. So how could we possibly like in context of India, create a socio-political environment where we could make more use of the positives of social media being driven by the negatives as we are currently? Because it can't be denied that social media is crucial, like you mentioned, but we are being driven by negatives more than positives, and that's usually controlled by the state. So how can we turn to the positives more?
Sangeeta, would you like to take a couple of questions and then answer them together, or do you want to answer them one by one? Your choice. You are on mute. You are on mute. We can't hear you.
Whichever works for you, let me know. Because I
Okay.
think
So you, yes.
so I can take a couple then.
Okay, fine. Dr. Ramesh Kumar, sir, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please, ma'am. I have also written. Thank you very much for providing me an opportunity. I have written the question in the chat box, but I would like to ask first, हम किधर जा रहे हैं? दशा और दिशा हमारी क्या है? My humble submission is who will explore and expose the few individuals and social elements, public nexus, involved in creating the crisis in society, state, and system. This is my question. Because we find that if there is so much problem, a few individuals are using and misusing their liberty against the DGP, legislature, executive, judiciary on social media. Why the IT cell is not taking, who will come forward? This is my humble submission. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Excellent viewpoint. Good luck.
Thank you. Jeevika, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Sure, ma'am.
Would you like to raise your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please.
Okay, ma'am. So, I am a student of political science department, first year in SLET only. So, my question was, apart from the big tech companies you just mentioned, don't you think that our own state tries to encroach upon our privacy the most? Isn't it hypocritical of the present ruling government at the center promoting the idea of quote unquote digital India themselves cutting down internet supply in Jammu and Kashmir just after the abrogation of Article 370?
I think you can take those questions and then we can come back to the other question.
Yeah, so thank you for your great questions. And this, all the questions actually raise hope. Sometimes I get a bit sad, day in and day out crawling toxic data. And that really, I look like an extremely depressed figure. And so this actually brings hope to me, the kind of questions, because it shows that there is this actual silent majority are the ones who are actually silent but thinking about these big questions. They are not the one who are vociferous on the media and creating. All these three questions actually ties up with this thing about malicious actors doing this malfeasance and creating a toxic mess. And that is why I found it extremely crucial to bring forth the point uh, about changing the way, the environment of algorithms. Now, let's start with the first question, which is a very interesting question on creating a social media environment that fosters more positive interactions and conversation. And this is what, let me start with an example. There was a social network called Reddit. There is, as many of you know, about subreddits being considered to be areas where most of the polarization in America areas took place, and that slowly became replicated in other democracies. But in Reddit, Reddit also became a site of pornography and where exploitation was happening. But the users of Reddit themselves pushed back and said, no more of this. And and Reddit realized that this is a law of diminishing return. This doesn't make sense to us, and therefore they actually stopped it and created a platform which prevented this. Twitter and Facebook their feet has been held to the fire since the past few years, especially after Donald Trump was elected. Is that because their society tends to be a bit more vociferous when it comes to pushback. So there was this like that. No, what you are doing is wrong, and therefore Facebook started. Like I was part of one of these in India, for example, last in 2019. Facebook did this initiative, brought in experts to say, what can you do to make things better? Because we don't know about the language, so we don't know whether it is hate speech, and therefore we are compatible when it comes to six main languages. But after that, we can't understand different nuances, and also, please help us. The whole point is not that suddenly Facebook developed a conscience, is that Facebook suddenly realized that this is not helping us. They are being summoned and the world is waking up to the possibility. So if you see recently, the Facebook's oversight board has been created to find out about cases about which are hate speech and which is called extreme speech, because even there the definition problem comes in, but extreme speech, which can actually have real world ramifications when it comes to violence. So for the first time, Facebook has come out with this. And if you all notice that now Twitter, Facebook have come up with panels and buttons about misinformation, this is a wrong information, go to this site, even YouTube, the biggest offender, had this during this US presidential election came out with these panels about it. So coming to this, that slowly and slowly, social media and networks are waking up to the fact that there is a law of diminishing returns if we continue the path we are going to. So they are slowly and slowly bringing in this. But that has to develop a kind of a mass scale pushback, which is not happening. Until and unless a mass scale pushback doesn't happen, there will never be this positive, like in an age of information overload, as you rightly pointed out. A platform will need to re-engineer itself. And that is where, when I spoke about materiality, this comes in here. You have to re-change your environment when the profit model no longer serves. And this is slowly happening because Twitter has started doing this slowly and slowly. But the thing is that at least they're doing it. 2 years back, we didn't think they would do it. But Facebook and Twitter is doing it. Who would have thought they would flag Trump? But they're doing it that. So this is a straw in the right wind direction, we can say. So
they also removed Facebook removed the farmers protest page.
exactly, but then there was the pushback, and therefore they were forced to restore it.
Restore it, yes.
So that is what I find interesting. They wouldn't have restored it because, as you know, the head of Facebook is, we all know that's an open secret. But, but he was forced to restore the page. So, because after all, it's not the government who's going to, be your major consumer. You are a social network. Ultimately, you are a social network. And you can't be a social network of a minority faction, however vociferous they may be. I have seen, like, to give you an insider view, is that when I go and crawl data on Twitter, something hopeful for all of you, and that would probably encourage you all also to be, amplifiers of positive speech, is that every day I basically crawl data from Twitter and take out, this thing and all. So when we are crawling, from 2019, actually, I started seeing this pushback happen. Previously, people were a bit chill. They were not telling, there were people who would use abusive terms and name call and shut down people. But now, from 2019, like many social media experts are telling me that, Nala, you are being, you're being too much of an optimist. Nothing's going to happen. But numbers don't lie. There's something called bystander effect. It means the bystanders were now started to speak, and they were not getting, they were not being silenced. So this pushback is happening. It has forced the platforms to rethink their algorithms. Once you rethink your algorithms, you rethink your business model. Like, what are you going to amplify, what you're not going to amplify. And that will create a propitious environment for a more positive democratic conversation and interaction. And this segues to the second question on accountability. It's a very good question because Dr. Kumar raised this about a small, they say that the bad fish dirties the entire pond and all. So this is basically this entire thing that what we have seen, even like we were tracking protest movements, and we saw that even the top 500 posts of different platforms like YouTube, Instagram, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, we saw these were dominated by just 12 to 15 influencers. And these 12 to 15 influencers are creating a toxic situation, a toxic mess. Even this recent death by suicide of a famous actor, Joyjit Pal, as you all know, in Microsoft Research, he did, because we also found it very weird because we are not hearing the noise, what we call the white noise. We are seeing the data. So it's very easy for us to know what is a bot, what is not a bot. They copy paste this thing and they put it there. And there are sock puppet networks. Sock puppet networks are basically trolls and bots. Together they work in concert. So it's very easy to see a concerted campaign. And even then we saw that these were just a few groups. So 80,000 plus bots who created this entire narrative, which were mainstream media piggybacked on this and created their own. So this makes our job actually easier. There are a small group of people who are who are creating a mess and polarization, and these small group of people have to be deplatformed. And therefore, there is this whole thing of mass reporting that is happening, which was badly used by this puppet. So, and therefore, Facebook and Twitter, last December, there was Twitter got this whole. There was a group of expert panels who came in and told. Means we had there was a conversation with Twitter about deplatforming these, even if they are government heavyweights and all. There must be stages of punishment. Either you put down their posts or you label their posts, and ultimately, when those two things don't happen, you deplatform them and then prevent them from replatforming. So now we have come to the labeling post part, we have come to the taking down the post part. Deplatforming happened for few influencers, but they came up with a new ID. So now there is a whole conversation happening to deplatform them. And I think if there is again I come back to the first, if there is more of a pushback, then they will be deplatformed, regardless of them having political patronage. Because at least till now, we still depend on, no one would like to be that unpopular and all. And I have actually seen many of these, what we call these merchants of hate, actually getting some sort of a reaction is coming. So there are hopeful signs, but a lot needs to be done, which brings us to the third question on state encroachment. That once we talk about digital India, but how do we do all this when state is the perpetrator? Because what do we do when, because all of us are scared. Like when I write on Facebook, like even though I know, like I never write on Twitter, but when I write on Facebook, my parents and my family and my friends, they all say that don't write. Please don't write this. Even there's a whiff of criticism, don't write. They're all scared. And that's not, we don't, so what are we scared of? We're not scared about Facebook. We're not, because we have not yet reached platform democracy stage. But we are scared of something else. So what do we do to prevent it? And India has, I wrote in Welt 16 actually about, this one I had written in last year, about India being the largest, means the largest internet shutdowns being done by India. And this happening in Jammu and Kashmir, which is scary. And so how do you reconcile this? Fact is that since Jibita, you yourself can see this, that there is this kind of this is a dissonance between a government stated objective and what it is doing on the ground. There are many like you who are doing the same. For them also, this is also becoming glaring, this kind of a dissonance between a stated position and what is happening. And all this will have a fallout, which will make them rethink it. Because no one, as you all have studied, I think you have studied the arc of history and how regimes come up and go down. A hardline stance doesn't work in the long term. Means history has shown us this, that a hardline stance never works in the long term, especially for a country as diverse as India. This so let's, I don't know exactly which, but there are a lot of people who are now flagging this kind of a thing. And uh, until and unless the personal data protection bills against internet shutdowns, those don't get that kind of, we don't know which way it will go. Only if we know that there is a proper personal data protection bill and not what we are having at present, which is an extremely dangerous version where our sensitive personal data can be misused by one entity, and that's the state. There's only exception to sensitive, not even personal data, sensitive personal data. Nowhere in the world this is the state. Until then, we cannot, then digital democracy can be a very, if it is unregulated, it can be a very worrying prospect. Yeah.
Rimlina, you want to ask your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very wonderful session. Firstly, thank you, Dr. Sangeeta, ma'am. My question was, what are the steps that one can take in order to avoid being a surveilled citizen? Like, in
Sorry?
various, uh, like the steps that we can take in order to avoid being a surveilled citizen. Like as you mentioned, there are surveilled citizens. Ma'am, like is the VPN, virtual private network, a new way? Will that help us save our data? Sometimes some even say that VPN can actually penetrate the China's firewall. So is this the new way?
The other question was by Zainab. I saw your hand raised. Would you want to ask a question? Zainab? Zainab? Are you there? Okay, looks like she's not there. Shaivi, you want to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, my question is that there's been this whole surveillance through Aadhaar, and we've seen in recent years that anti-Aadhaar activists and voices have always been shut down with a force, unlike we've seen in other circumstances. So I wanted to know what Dr. Mahapatra thinks about how citizens should respond in when it's the government machinery which forces the citizens into these acts of surveillance, wherein like the citizen knows that this will be used as a form of surveillance by the government, but they have absolutely no choice but to give in to these acts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I will add on to that. I mean, increasingly, aren't we seeing a consolidation or closing of the ranks of the media, the social media and the state? And together they make a formidable force through their manipulators and influencers.
Yeah.
That's one part of the question. And probably other thing that strikes me is uh, what do you think about competition amongst the various networks, social media networks, and YouTube and Facebook, ShareChat and WhatsApp? Can they sort of level each other out? Can we expect a kind of free market economy, which perfect competition situation emerging? Is that some kind of a possibility? And one last bit I would want to, since we are a women's university, and I think we deserve this, is the repercussions on gender of this media. I mean, I see tremendous repercussion on gender relations. You spoke about power relations, how the media reinforces certain power relations. In that sense, something you could elaborate on.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Your
absolutely.
side on gendered media.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent thing that we have. Yeah, that's a very good, very this interesting question. Uh, so coming to the question on what steps we can take against surveillance is first is that there is something called opt-in and opt-out clause in privacy settings. All of you have, please go to your social media networks and please promote it amongst your social network groups, because a platform, people are putting pressure on the platform to do it, and therefore Facebook recently has started privacy grants, where they want researchers to come and uh, that's a good question. Yeah. So researchers to come and help them out in the privacy thing, where privacy is good economics, in the sense that it is more acceptable that them not violating privacy. So how do you do it? So there are the opt-in, opt-out clauses. So where you have that, you have the agency to deny them certain information about yourself. Start small and make it big. That is what most privacy scholars say. Don't take technology, which like people do believe that if you see any privacy scholar worth their salt would completely say don't use Alexa. They would say, don't use anything that has a facial recognition kind of a technology, because these are policing technologies. These are invasive technologies. Even if you have Zuckerberg himself, if you all heard about that, he basically puts a sellotape over the camera on his laptop. He doesn't, keep it in. So, and therefore, many of Lenovo had to do a new innovation in this new category of laptops and create a hide the camera, open the camera button, because that was the demand now, that people are becoming slowly and slowly privacy conscious. So first is check out the opt-in, opt-out clauses of all your apps, and do not use third-party apps to access anything. Create a separate email for accessing anything. Like for example, Facebook and Google. People say that if you have Facebook and Google, the idea of privacy is notional. And that's true, because so if you are using Facebook app to do a kind of a retail shopping or buy something through your Facebook account, please do not do that, because that's an easy access to all your data. And remember, there's a whole industry of data harvesters, people brokers, we are called, who basically, like in Facebook, data is sold to a lot of data brokers for targeted advertising and marketing. And this is also sold, also not, may not be sold, but given to different states and governments for political targeting. So there is a whole literature on political ads being put in Facebook. So Daniel Kreis has done a lot of work on this, on Facebook ads, ad targeting. Siva Vaidyanathan is another very good one who's worked on Facebook especially, because that's one of the largest platforms for political ad targeting. So not just companies, but political ads also target people through this kind of thing. So please check your privacy settings of Facebook. And you have, I know they have created a very cumbersome pages, but if you do see it, do it. So there's a whole literature coming to make this privacy setting more consumer friendly and accessible, so that it just pops up and you decide that no more cookies. So European Union, for example, has created policies that ban cookies. What are cookies? Cookies are digital imprints. Whichever websites you go, they create a unique identifier for you and tells that you are going to this website, you're going to this website. So when you visit multiple websites on your cell phone or on your laptop or desktop, is something called cookie syncing. Means different cookies from different websites are compiled by third-party trackers, and they create your unique profile, and that's how they target you. So always clear your history, your tabs, and all these are some basic things to do it. And now there is a pressure on the this is on the individual level, since you asked what I can do to prevent myself. But at the policy level and stated level, there is a pressure to stop fingerprint tracking, that is digital fingerprint tracking and cookie syncing. So European Union is creating a common benchmark. It is left to be seen whether India follows that or not. So GDPR, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation Bill of the European Union, is very stringent about all this. That can be a role model for India. Our personal data protection bill was supposed to be modeled on it, but it became a watered down version. So now there is a lot of debate and heat in the parliament happening about this. Now they have taken a winter break. So we know which way their wind blows. Yeah. So, and a very good question you asked is, can they use VPN, to prevent it? No, I would, because see, after all, like Nordstrom, Super Shark, Express, these are some common VPNs which are used. But ultimately, if the government wants your data, they can ask your service provider where you're going. So VPNs have not been found to be that of a kind of solid protection against being surveilled. But there are browsers, like I would obviously talk about Mozilla. That was what attracted me towards applying for Mozilla, is that Mozilla has its own browser, which is brilliant in privacy protection. It can't protect everything, but it gives you the kind of protection that Google will never give you. And Tor Tor browser is one of the best browsers for privacy conscious individuals. So TOR. So there's an entire open source code, open source project called Tor, which is a good privacy protection. For emails, Gmail, anyone can find out what you've written in a Gmail, so it's not protected. So Proton Mail is something that people use who are privacy conscious. So these are some ways in which technology has also created alternatives which can be used in mass scale. So it's not like something which is difficult. Like many technologies are very, they're privacy conscious, but they inhibit consumer friendly practices. They're not very convenient to use. But technology realizes that to be incorporated in mass scale, you can also give privacy along with convenience. So these are certain things which have emerged in the past few years, which is actually a good sign because it's showing that technology also shows that privacy is a viable model which we need to cater to. So this also brings us to the question on Aadhaar. There are so many. I met. There are so many lawyers, especially, and in India, like Center for Internet and Society, Access Now, Internet Freedom Foundation, that I've seen. They are the ones who are at the front line dealing with about this thing, not creating a kind of, not violating our privacy through making Aadhaar mandatory. However, as the pandemic basically created a problem there, because now there is a new threat about health digital card, where even your health card will be synced with Aadhaar, and all your data will come about your past history, your sexual preferences. So that's a danger. And yes, a lot of RTI activists and an extremely weakened RTI law is not preventing this kind of a protection. But this is up to us to decide which way we are going. Are we going? So what we can do is only raise alarm bells. But if for it to actually become a policy, have a policy impact, it has to show that it is popularly, people are not going to take their privacy abuse as commonplace, where we again come back to surveillance democracy, which I was talking about. So while the first few questions spoke about platform democracy, and this is talking about surveillance democracy, which is really scary. So yeah, so Aadhaar activists can only, they are raising it, and kudos to them, and they're doing this courage and all to do it. Unfortunately, that's not translating into pressure tactics. So we can be idealistic, but unless we don't up the stakes and create real pressure, there's not going to be anything done. And the health ID card is really scary. So coming to the question on this is Professor Madhava's question, which is really interesting, is that about the consolidation. I don't know, like I think many of you do not probably are very young, or because we lived in an age where the mainstream media had to follow the BBC model. And suddenly in 2000, later on, we have suddenly seen a complete sea change in the media. The entire complexion has changed, where you can get away with, there was traditionally any editorial policy. I'll talk about my own magazine. There was an editorial policy that you have to fact check. It has to go through editorial gatekeeping. Deputy editors, associate editors. One article would go through so many rungs. You didn't need fact checkers because one article would go through so many rungs of fact checking and edits before it actually made it to the page. Yeah, there has been this consolidation, this triangulation of state managed media, what we call, and the social media dominance. In fact, this is the current dominant structure and creating the regime of truth, and what Foucault says. Yet, in a country like India, and given its vernacular diversity, given its so much of diversity and ideological diversity, we have so many caste groups with different interests. Yet this is something that is unsustainable in the long run. And what we are seeing is this is happening. There are these the cracks happening at the level, at the lower level of the embankments, where other insurgent ideas are creeping up. What they call anti-national ideas, insurgent ideas are creeping up. I had actually seen it, to give you an example, that there are many news sites which are coming up, which are digital news sites. So they have now try to weaken those sites by the new FDI rules to make them close shop. But one closes shop, another comes up because of our country. Our country gives us hope because of its dizzying diversity that we see in our country. So I just want to see which way it will go, because at this moment we can see this. In 2019 there was this immense consolidation, but after that I have seen so many new sites coming up on, like, even YouTube's recommendation, just to see whether the machine teaches you. YouTube suddenly recommends, like, you see something coming from a dominant hegemonical ideological group, then you have three alternatives being recommended by YouTube. And they are not actually recommending the same site which was happening before. So this brings us to this interesting question of antitrust and competitive social medias platforms. So the different social medias and tech companies will balance each other. This is a highly timely and extremely critical question. Tech monopolies are now facing, Facebook especially and Google especially is facing a lot of antitrust laws and lawsuits in Europe, in US, in UK, in many countries, not India, but in many countries, where they have called them up and they have to pay heavy penalties, like in billions and millions, in three-digit millions, they have to pay for uh, for their monopolistic this thing. So on the one hand, we are seeing Facebook having three major platforms. So inter-platforms are happening. You're having Instagram, you're having Facebook, you're having WhatsApp under Facebook. So they are controlling one of the most used platforms. Then you're having Google, YouTube, Google, then Messenger. All these groups so you're having inter-platform dominance of a few tech companies. So the competition is not much at present, because most of these different platforms are controlled by a handful of companies. But on the other hand, you're having governments who are waking up to this possibility and holding these mega industries to account, because and this has happened from 2019 to 2020 onwards. This huge antitrust filings are happening to reduce this. So yes, this is a very timely thing, and so people are talking about breaking Facebook, breaking Google. So yeah, so this is actually coming up because this. I think there was a recent article about this having gained momentum. Yeah, you're right.
I think there's one more question. Riddhi, would you want to ask a question? Riddhi?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. This is Riddhi. Actually, I have even done the journalism, so I can relate your lecture absolutely with myself. So, I would like to ask you one simple question: that how politics in India use media in agenda setting and two-step flow theories for their gaining of their own political parties.
Yeah, that's a good question. Should I answer that?
Yes, yes. And I don't think we have too much time to take more questions, so we'll.
Yeah. So we are actually doing a research paper on agenda setting and partisan media, where we are actually tracking this. So this is an ongoing, so look out for the paper. Yeah. So basically, so for the political scientists, what is agenda setting is basically a media will frame an issue and prime an audience according to certain beliefs. That is how I present an issue, what kind of visibility I give to that issue, how I project that issue, and then try to change behavior of the news consumers to act in that way. So that is called framing, priming, and making them behave in such a way is called agenda setting. So So for the rest, let me get that clear. So are they doing this? So every time there is, right from time immemorial, media has been the handmaiden of politicians. It's not something that has happened suddenly. In America, you don't have the BBC model. It was always there. Fox News was always supposed to be for the Republicans. MSNBC was always for the Democrats. And New York Times was always for the Democrats, and you find Wall Street Journal for the Republicans. So, and they wore their party affiliation on their sleeves, and they set agendas. So people basically knew that yes, this is agenda, and I want to follow it. In India, this was not the case, and however, in the last few years, we see a complete change in the DNA of our media, where there has been clear partisanship and complete systemic structural changes of the media in terms of even the owners of the media have started wearing their party affiliations on their sleeve. But this is one way of seeing that who owns the media. So previously, there were not many politicians who were owning the media. There were Congress was had National Herald. We knew the mouthpiece of Shiv Sena. We knew the mouthpiece of BJP, RSS. We knew that, but they were known as the partisan media. They were not known as the mainstream media. Now we do know it as mainstream media. So this is something. Can it be irreversible? We don't know. Should it be irreversible? Also, we don't know, because we can't put our own preference on the consumers. If they want partisan media, they are getting the partisan media. So, how is it agenda setting happening? What Professor Madhava brought in here is very important here, because she spoke about the consolidation that is happening with the mainstream media and social media. So, previously, there was a distinction between social media and mainstream media. Unfortunately, and it was also seen that the social media, whatever topic was trending, was being used by the mainstream media as their lead topics, as their main topics. But now what we see is that both a larger social media has created something called imposter news sites on social media. Like people actually go there thinking that's a news. On Facebook, please beware of these. For agenda setting purposes, they were created. So basically, these are sites on Facebook. If you check their character profile, they call themselves news and websites. This in disinformation studies are called imposter news sites because they are not registered. They don't follow gatekeeping rules, and therefore they don't follow like what we call in India RNI, Registrar of Newspaper of India. They don't follow any of these kind of regulations or this thing or Press Council of India norms. Anyway, the mainstream media is also not doing it, but these sites are plainly imposter sites which do agenda setting. And what we find, what you're saying about the mainstream media are getting their data from these sites. And they will call these sites fact-checking organizations and all. And they will put a screenshot of it and create a juggernaut of disinformation, happening, and that becomes a misinformation. So agenda setting is a real and clear threat of hyper partisanship and hyper polarization. So not like normal polarization is fine. It happens in every society. It's been there. What we are seeing is hyper partisanship and hyper polarization by this influence campaigns, which has gone beyond setting agendas, that is setting policy priorities or showcasing a government priority, to actually trying to influence and social engineer their entire consumer base. So this is what is happening, where we have called, therefore there's this huge noise is growing for platform regulation.
Okay, I think we'll have to now call it a day because we're almost 2 hours into this. It's been wonderful 2 hours, and we thoroughly enjoyed your the ease with which you deal with some very very technical concept, and the flow of your thoughts has been absolutely amazing. We could not have called for a better person to start off our lecture series, and I'm sure your the students have also enjoyed a lot, and they have related with you on the way you've handled the questions, and it's just been amazing. Thank you so much. But to formally offer a vote of thanks, I will call upon our first year student, Shaivi. Shaivi, can you?
Yes, ma'am. Uh, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Mahapatra for making time for us today and for extensively illustrating the all encompassing nature of digital media in the present socio-political environment, and for highlighting how it's challenging our traditional notions of democracy through immense means. Uh, I would also like to thanks the head of our department, Dr. Manisha Madhava, for giving our batch the opportunity to organize this event and for her patience over the last 3 weeks that was spent organizing this event. I'd also like to thank the rest of you for attending today's lecture. I hope this has been an informational experience for all of you. I'd now like to conclude the first lecture of the monthly series by the Political Science Department of SNDT Women's University. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Manisha, for inviting me, and thank you so much for listening to me patiently.
It's always a pleasure, and I'm going to get back to you for the gender part of it again.
Oh, sorry, sir, I forgot. There's a huge literature on that also. I have faced that trolling and chilling our voice.
So we'll have a separate session for that, maybe.
That's a huge topic in itself.
Yes, yes.
We call that manosphere. In manosphere, how women are being chilled. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's good, and maybe we'll have.
Yeah, we did. We went and we were with WhatsApp groups and we were checking chats as participant observers, and that was what was really scary.
So that's going to be a wonderful, as a part of our project. You can come in and give us your insights, and sort of we can get all the students together also to work on various. I'm sure you've inspired a lot of them to take up something on media and do some and I think I will be failing in my duties if I don't thank the first year students who've been very enthusiastic and generally the seniors also, but this time in particular, the first year students, they've just walked into the university and they're bubbling with enthusiasm, and I've really enjoyed the way they have connected with you and the way they have organized this thing. I think we are going to see you more and we are going to have many more such sessions. So thank you, Sangeeta. And I was just telling my husband, he was asking me about you, and I said, we are Guru Behen, because our Guru is the same. We have done the same, and our PhDs under the same supervisors. So it's wonderful, and stay safe, stay connected, and hoping to see you more. Thank you so much for sparing such a wonderful time with us.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody. Stay
Good
safe.
luck, each and everybody.
Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Many thanks. Good luck. All the best for the next year, new year.
Students, can you please switch on your cameras? We can have one group photo. Students, can we expect you to stay for a minute and then switch off your cameras? Participants, please. Can you please switch on your camera so that we can have one group photograph? Physically, we would have had a nice big group photograph, but unfortunately, Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Many thanks for your kind.
It's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Good luck.
join, and thank you so
Good
much.
afternoon.